From Sahara Forest Project's futuristic farming technology to the revegetation of desert plants reducing its carbon footprint, here's how this farm grows vegetables in the middle of the desert. Out there in one of the driest regions of the world, there's a place doing the unthinkable, growing crops right in the middle of the desert. Shocked? Me too. But guess what? This one country in Southwest Asia has cracked the code, all thanks to the Sahara Forest Project. The futuristic farm for a country like Jordan is actually a huge deal. Here's the thing. Jordan's a net import country that gets almost 98% of their food from the rest of the world. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the country was already working on food strategic reserves to mitigate the risks of food insecurity because of the lack of resources necessary for large-scale cultivation. Not only that, but Jordan's also one of the world's most water-poor countries too, which makes growing crops like wheat, corn, and rice super difficult for farmers, who are already trying to curb the climate catastrophe. But despite all of this, there's still hope. In Aqaba, the only coastal city in Jordan located near the Red Sea shore, the desert farmers are hard at work. Not only are they growing crops of cucumbers and peppers, but boy, are their passion fruits thriving too. And I know what you're thinking, how's Jordan managing all of this? Well, remember the Sahara Forest Project I just talked about? Yeah, so it all started back in 2009 in Copenhagen, where the first SFP feasibility studies were presented at the UN climate negotiations. Over time, the idea to grow crops by using biomimicry was new for sure, but it also looked promising. And that's exactly why today, by modifying factors required for basic plant growth, Jordan's making history. Now, the desert farm in Aqaba mainly runs on two things: sunlight and seawater. The place uses solar panels to provide power for a system that not only evaporates seawater, but also keeps the air in the greenhouse cool and humid. And not just that, but while the solar panels also help remove salt from the seawater, the plants that can still tolerate salt, they're grown in the hedges of the greenhouse, which helps with its cooling. The system's pretty neat if you ask me, and there's a lot of recycling involved too. For example, under the shadows of the solar panels, the desert farms grow crops that otherwise wouldn't be able to thrive in harsh sunlight. This includes herbs and salads that normally only require 6 hours of direct sunlight. Farmers also go the extra mile and pollinate the crops by hand, bringing in wasps after, to provide natural pest control. Aside from that, the waste products from the farm and other nearby businesses are also being turned into fertilizer so that the farm can enrich the soil rather than degrading it, and that's important. According to the managing director of the Sahara Forest Project, Ketil Steak, huge pastures of land are destroyed way too often to make food. So to prevent that from happening, the SFP is an example to show how the damage to the land can be reversed and that it is possible to produce food in a way that's good for the planet. Not only has this helped curb Jordan's food crisis, but it's also helped increase its exports too. In 2023, the main crop by the desert farmers at Aqaba is snack cucumbers, and they're being prepared for a large shipment all the way to Norway in fall. In the past, through the Sahara Forest Project, the crops were able to yield staples like salads, sweet potatoes, beans, and herbs, which is pretty impressive when you think about the technology behind it. Like I said, the core technologies used for these crops are solar power, seawater, and revegetation, or recycling. But how does each of these contribute to mass production, contributing to exports? I'll tell you how. As far as solar power is concerned, the inspiration for it comes from Archimedes, who once used polished shields to concentrate sunlight onto the invading Roman fleet. Now folks, while the Greek mathematician did that to keep the enemies from Syracuse, the Sahara Forest Project has used that principle to generate renewable energy to power their farms. Typically, thermal power plants require having super hot steam to run turbines and the coldest condenser temperature to run efficiently, and for the highest efficacy, modern systems require wet cooling from evaporating water for optimum functioning of the plant. Wet cooling not only has a significant effect, but it's also cost-effective too. It has lower investments than dry cooling, but the only downside is that it requires large volumes of fresh water that's not often available in wet areas. So how does Jordan fix that? Well, this is where the seawater-cooled greenhouses come in. The main purpose of a greenhouse is to provide a controlled environment for plants that ensures their optimal growth. For the Sahara Forest Project in particular, these greenhouses are maintained by the cooling effect that generates when the salt water evaporates, and this minimizes the crop's water requirement while increasing the yield with a minimal carbon footprint. The basic principle behind this is, when the air entering the greenhouse facility is conditioned through pads and pushed around with fans into the growing environment. Through the inflatable ducts under the crops, it makes sure that all the air is distributed evenly through the area. Now, when there's enough air in the greenhouse, this creates a positive pressure that stops the untreated air from entering the space, and eventually, the air is pushed out through openings at a high level. In a place like Jordan, where it's typically hot and dry most times of the year, the incoming air is pulled over the evaporative pads with salty seawater running over them. The process of evaporation then cools the hot air, producing cool and humid conditions in the greenhouse. Now, when it is cool and humid outside, the desert farmers also have a solution for that. Under the greenhouse facility, there are conventional heating pipes used to heat up the environment, and not just that, but waste heat coming from the solar panels can also be used to kickstart the evaporation of water, creating hot, humid air that circulates in the roof cavity. As that hot air condenses and cools down, the water droplets formed are distilled water, or fresh water if you may, that is sufficient to grow crops. The entire process does sound confusing, but when you think about it, it's basic science. The SFP hasn't only figured out a way to utilize air and heat energy to grow new crops, but they've also got the technology for revegetation. The results of the evaporation process are not always 100%. Because of the salt concentration of seawater, sometimes the water still contains brine even after much of the water has evaporated. But instead of letting that freshwater resource go to waste, that water is driven into the SFP facility to evaporative hedges placed throughout the site. Now, these bad boys have a dual purpose. They concentrate the brine as water's lost to the outside environment. And just like the physics that drives the evaporative systems in the greenhouse, these hedges allow cooling and humidification of areas that are downwind of their position. This creates humidified spaces for outdoor vegetation and the plants that can take advantage of the cooler, more humid, and wind-sheltered environment can thrive in their optimum environment. Not only that, but this also helps curb desertification of the area too. When these humid environments are created, the native desert species that are accustomed to growing in such areas start growing rapidly and densely between the hedges. Many will even do so without any irrigation, while some might benefit from the freshwater supply from the SFP greenhouse. Revegetating low-productivity desert areas like Jordan also had another effect on the environment. Remember how I just talked about minimal carbon footprint earlier? Well, when desert plants grow in abundance, they will sequester carbon from the atmosphere into their oases plants, roots, and soil. This allows for the removal of carbon dioxide from the air, storing it in a previously barren land, giving us a genuinely carbon-negative solution. So you see how it all comes together, right? The solar panels concentrate the sunlight, generating enough heat to power steam turbines, and then the salt water from the seas used to cool it down so it can function properly. This also creates a humid environment for the greenhouse, allowing the plants to thrive, and then whatever wastewater is left, it goes off to the hedges, where desert vegetation regrows, taking in the carbon dioxide, minimizing the overall carbon footprint. So far, this entire system has been able to produce high-value crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and even flowers. But considering how much potential it has, it can expand to a global scale and hopefully help with the food crisis all over the world. So there you have it. From drastically reducing its carbon footprint to Sahara Forest Project's futuristic farming technology, that was how this farm grows vegetables in the middle of the desert.